Hannah Evans, who'd been closely following the road all this time, suddenly touched the driver's hand and pointed to a lonely high-rise building on the corner of the street. "There, that's the place. Wait in the car, Luke. I'll do the rest myself," said the young woman, who looked about 30 years old. Hannah got out of the expensive car and headed towards the multi-story building where the representatives of the contractor firm had already been waiting for her in the lobby. A little further, at the window, stood a small group of people. They were the building tenants. All of them closely watched the young, elegantly dressed woman. Their future depended on her decision. Hannah walked in slowly and greeted everyone respectfully. Then the woman went to the wall and gently ran her hand over the smooth surface. Almost none of the people in the lobby knew that Miss Evans had visited this building many years ago. Sure, back then she was just a little girl that no one knew, with light brown pigtails and heavenly blue eyes. Hannah's parents met by chance when they were both a little over 20. Steve Evans had just demobilized from the Army, where he served on contract in the Marine Corps. Dressed in full uniform, the man stood at the bus stop waiting for the bus that would take him to his hometown. But when it was time to board the bus, Steve noticed a young woman with a huge suitcase, which she tried to squeeze into the cabin unsuccessfully. Of course, the compassionate young man helped the woman with her luggage, meanwhile learning that her name was Beverly. As it turned out, the young people were going to the same city, which got them both rather excited. Neither Steve nor Beverly had nothing to show for themselves. The woman was an orphan. She moved from city to city in search of work and a better life. Sure, Steve had his salary of several months of service on him, but that amount hardly made him rich. During their trip, the young people talked a lot and felt a strong mutual sympathy. Steve always preferred to be straightforward and to the point. Thus, he asked Beverly to move in with him while they were still on the bus. The fact was that the man's parents lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, and he didn't want to cause any discomfort by moving in with them. Hearing Steve's tempting offer, Beverly happily agreed. She immediately took a liking to the dark-skinned young military man with kind gray eyes. Upon arrival in the city, the young people lived in a roadside motel for the first couple of days. And then, pulling all their savings together, they bought a small house located near the apartment building. Since Steve learned to drive almost any kind of transport in the Army, he decided to get a job as a truck driver. The trucking company where Steve worked carried out cargo transportations around the country, and thus provided its employees with consistently high salary. Unfortunately, finding a job for Beverly turned out to be a lot more difficult. Therefore, not wanting to be a burden for her future husband, she got a job as a cleaner in one of the city's cleaning companies. Soon the young people got married, and 9 months later, little Hannah was born. The girl grew up in the atmosphere of love and care. Her parents surrounded her with it from the first days of her life. Time flew by, and the first serious misfortune befell the Evans family when Steve's truck got into a terrible accident. The accident wasn't Steve's fault. For some reason, the driver of the SUV drove into the oncoming lane, and Steve had to swerve in another direction to avoid collision. This risky maneuver caused the man's truck and its load to fall into a ditch. Unfortunately, by the time the doctors arrived at the scene, Steve was already dead. That day, Hannah and Beverly baked his favorite cherry pie and were looking forward to their father's return home. But when the phone rang and 7-year-old Hannah saw tears in her mother's eyes, the girl realized that something terrible had happened. Hannah didn't remember much about her father's funeral. The only thing was that stuck in her memory was the tear-stained face of her mother, which went on to carry the imprint of grief and sadness for many years to come. The father's death had a significant effect on the family's financial situation as well, since now the family's income decreased by several times. Now Beverly had to work for two in order to provide for herself and her little daughter. She did her best to handle the increasing volume of work provided by the cleaning company. One of the buildings that Beverly provided her cleaning services to was a multi-story building on the corner of Main Street. Since there was a lot of work there, Hannah's mother tried to clean it first. One winter, Beverly got sick. She had a fever and couldn't go to work. As the woman's condition was getting worse each day, Hannah called an ambulance. As it turned out, Beverly had pneumonia. Its treatment required all the money they had at the time. Little Hannah looked at her sick mother with tears in her eyes and even spoon-fed her chicken soup, which she cooked herself. "Get well, Mommy. I know you're strong," said the girl, trying to make her voice sound cheerful and optimistic. And to make sure that Beverly didn't lose her job, Hannah worked instead of her, cleaning up that high-rise building that was assigned to her mother. Every day, Hannah put on her mother's rubber boots on top of 3 pairs of socks and the rubber gloves that reached almost to her elbows. She took the mop and cleaned the hallway and the stairway. Then she wiped the window seals and the entrance doors with the damp cloth. Many tenants were sympathetic towards the little hard worker, and only Mrs. Taylor and her daughter humiliated and put her down every time they went by. One day, the obnoxious people deliberately pushed the bucket of water standing on the steps, which made all of Hannah's labor go to waste. "What's this mess you have here? Do you want my daughter or me to wet our feet or ruin our coats? Bear in mind they cost a lot of money," Mrs. Taylor said viciously, kicking the empty bucket with her shoe. Gritting her teeth, Hannah found the strength to endure the humiliation. Only after the mother and her daughter left did she let herself cry. The little girl sat on the steps and smeared the tears all over her face. She thought about why people were so cruel to those poor or less fortunate. 10 days later, Beverly recovered and began to gradually get back to work. Hannah still helped her mother for the next couple of months. Each time she came across Mrs. Taylor and her daughter, she had to face their underground hatred. Deep in her soul, the girl understood that by making jokes and humiliating her, the unbearable couple was trying to assert themselves and amuse their pride. Days seemed to fly by at lightning speed. Beverly continued to work as a cleaner while Hannah went to high school. She was doing exceptionally well in all subjects, delighting her teachers. The only thing that poisoned the girl's life was the disdainful attitude of her classmates, who only ever saw her as the poor cleaner's daughter. Their bullying often caused Hannah to cry bitter tears, but she only let herself do it within the walls of her own home. "What? Have you washed all the floors yet? The queen of mops and rags," her peers would shout at her, not realizing how painful it was for the unfortunate girl. Their lives went on as usual, exactly until the moment when one early September morning, someone knocked at Mrs. Evans' door. Wondering who it might be, Beverly opened the door and saw the postman on her doorstep. He handed her a registered letter. Beverly and Hannah opened the letter together, and when they did, they saw a notice of the need to enter into inheritance that came from the other end of the country. As it turned out, Beverly wasn't actually an orphan. Apparently, her great-uncle lived in New York, where he made a huge fortune by chance. Since the man led a rather secluded life and didn't have a family, his granddaughter Beverly and his great-granddaughter Hannah inherited his fortune after he passed away. They were tracked down by the attorneys of the deceased millionaire. The news sounded so shocking and incredible that the mother and daughter initially thought that they were being pranked. But the stamped paper with watermarks and seals ruled out even the slightest likelihood of forgery. Thus, in one instant, Hannah turned from the cleaner's daughter into a rich heiress with a multi-million-dollar fortune. That day marked the beginning of Beverly and Hannah's new life, full of prosperity and luxury. The kind of life they dreamed of for so many years. When Hannah graduated from high school, she got accepted into one of the best universities in the entire country, which allowed her to get a great education. The young woman chose to study urban construction and architecture, which forever captured her heart. By virtue of her profession, Hannah traveled around the country a lot until one day she found herself in her hometown. By some twist of fate, the same apartment building where she washed floors many years ago caught the interest of the company she worked at. Only now, no one made fun of the elegantly dressed young woman who was about to decide whether the house would be restored or demolished. Every tenant rushed to show Miss Evans their respect and affection. Eventually, Hannah got to face Mrs. Taylor and her adult daughter. The stare-down lasted a few seconds, and the unbearable couple wandered away, lowering their eyes. Of course, they never expected that one day, the cleaning woman's daughter would be making the decision that could affect their lives. Mrs. Taylor and her daughter chose to judge people by their appearance and social status, without realizing that life is full of unpredictable surprises. People that used to be poor and seemingly unimportant could one day end up being at the top of the social ladder and see you as poor and now insignificant.